I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Ovul Sezer. She is an assistant professor of management and organizations at Cornell University. She studies the behavioral science of impression management and is also a stand-up comedian. I can see how those two overlap, and I'm excited to talk about it. Ovul, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thank you so much, Adam. Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Ovul, tell us about your journey into stand-up comedy.
Oh, sure. This is a common question that I get a lot, and I usually used to intellectualize my answer, of course, why I started doing comedy, which, I will get to in a
Like it
second.
connects to my research and all that versus just like, oh, it's fun and it improves my
Exactly,
confidence or
exactly.
whatever else.
Exactly. Usually I make the parallel, and I will explain that. But I would also like to say the reason why I started doing stand-up comedy is because I think I'm funny. I just
Yeah.
I just wanted to take this moment to cherish and maybe brag a little bit, and maybe we'll talk about bragging too. This is where both my research and stand-up comedy comes together. So I was always interested in comedy, and I do think that I was funny in my native language. I'm hilarious. For for those of you who don't agree that I'm funny now,
You can always blame the translation issue. That's a good scapegoat.
I'm gonna play my international card, even though I've been in the United States for 17 years, a whole lifetime now. But yeah, I was always interested in stand-up comedy, and one day I went to a workshop, and there was a lot of emphasis on observing other people and thinking about how people behave. And comedy comes from things that you find odd, confusing, or frustrating. And any observation you may have in that front, you can talk about it on stage. And the moment I heard that statement, I was like, wow, this is what we do anyways. This is as social scientists, I look at human behavior.
Mhm.
And we all look at human behavior, and we are trying to understand why we behave in certain ways. And we, as a behavioral scientist, I am more interested in the mistakes that we make. So that makes it even a more fertile ground for comedy.
Mhm.
So there's definitely a parallel. And I think I was also lucky that my first performance, my first comedy performance went okay.
Uh-huh.
So that I could go back to the stage, because obviously later on I did have moments where I completely bombed on stage, and I don't recommend that experience to anybody, because you
Right. And if that's your first experience, it'll just ruin it for you
oh,
forever.
exactly, it would be so hard to come back.
Uh-huh. So I guess that connects to this idea of first impressions and impression management, because there's obviously a first impression of a person, but then there's also these first impressions of just trying out a new hobby. And maybe if even if it was only due to bad luck that it goes bad the first time, you're probably going to be less likely to try it again.
Exactly, exactly. There's definitely something, especially about the stage experience. There's something sticky there, that the first experience you have, similar to the reason why I went back. Because it was such a wonderful feeling to hear laughter from an
Mhm.
audience. We share the moment. Sometimes I say, that just tells me my hypothesis was true. As a
Uh-huh.
researcher, the way that I test things is that I run an experiment and look at the data. As a comedian, you just say something, you make your joke, you deliver the punchline, and if there's laughter, that tells you that something must have been true there. So
Mhm.
that's a wonderful feeling to go back, and I agree with you that if it went the other way around, it would be so hard to go back. Both with the idea of impression management, and also how um, yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about, how our initial emotional state sort of determines the likelihood of resilience, maybe. I mean, that would be an interesting research question there.
Mhm.
The initial experience that we have sort of determines how resilient we are. If we get the positive first, maybe we are more likely to continue. But if we get the negative first, it's a bit harder to overcome that, I would
Uh-huh.
say.
I
Maybe there is
wonder if
research
you
on
could
that.
incorporate this into a personality framework, because one big five trait, neuroticism, for example, is something like units of negative emotion experienced per unit of negative experience. So if you're more neurotic, you're going to overreact to the same threat. And it's not necessarily just a bad thing, because if you underreact to threat, that can lead to risk taking, impulsivity, all sorts of other bad things on the opposite extreme. But there's sort of this whole calibration issue because even if you experience the opposite, like let's say just due to pure luck, you go on stage and it goes amazing, and then your second time you bomb. So you have this false confidence, and then you kind of get into a thing of like you start doubting yourself of like, oh, maybe that first experience wasn't actually reflective of my ability.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also no, I like the definition that you provided for neuroticism. I mean, the thinking about it in personality framework is so interesting because I was also thinking about, well, maybe openness to experience predicts
Uh-huh.
whether you would be interested in going on stage and share some very details of your personal life to make people laugh.
Right, or
Uh,
extroversion as well.
Definitely. Although, now that I think of my other comedian friends, I'm not sure about if they're all extroverts. These are all great empirical questions, because
Yeah.
especially to write the joke production process is quite introspective and very similar to actually us academics, where we go back to our corner or maybe share it with another academic friend, but it's kind of an introspective process, I would say. But
And
yeah, so
now that I think about it, every single dimension seems to be coming up. You have to be conscientious to write the jokes and to show up on time. Agreeableness, I imagine, comes in as well because comedians are often very good at saying things that a lot of people would say, like, oh, I could never say that, even if you're thinking it. So you need to be a bit disagreeable to go beyond that line.
yeah, yeah. And of course, another super interesting thing about all of this, maybe linking this back to personality research as well. These are some of the things that I'm also learning recently as a sort of new aspiring stand-up comedian, let's say. I do perform in comedy clubs in New York City, in ticketed shows. So in one way, it is maybe professional, but at the same time, I'm definitely learning lots of things. And one thing that we learn is that you have to you have to create your persona. And the
Mhm.
persona creation is a bit different than your personality, right? Persona is you sort of sculpt that persona with the audience as well. Let's imagine that I have a bit, and in some version of the bit, I'm very sweet. I'm using sweet humor. In the other parts, I'm a little sassy,
Huh.
and maybe I make fun of things in that manner. And the audience decides which version is funnier, which jokes are resonating with them more. And you sort of create that as you go along, which may be a little different than your own actual authentic personality.
Mhm.
Of course, the key is to make sure your persona is part of you as well, or maybe it seems very authentic that people don't even question it. Another fun fact for our academic audience, for the podcast, when I asked my comedy mentor, how long does it take to create a persona? He was like, 5 years or maybe 6. And I was like, oh my God, that's like a PhD.
Yeah.
That's a whole another process. So I'm nowhere close to that, but I'm definitely paying attention to it. So I would think of myself as quite an agreeable person in real life, but you're right that my stand-up persona actually is a
Mhm.
little maybe disagreeable.
Do you think that crafting of a persona applies in other fields as well? We can use academia for now, but you do work in marketing and business, so I'm sure that applies there as well. But in academia, there's almost this caricature of the like the nerdy academic who's going by the book for everything. But I notice, especially when you're talking about something outside of your own area of expertise, like I might know more about my research than most people, but any other scientific field, even as a scientist, I'm like, I have these lay intuitions that are wrong, just like the rest of us.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, like all of us. I mean, if you're let's say, only academic on a dinner table with your friends or family, you may get the question about, oh, you're a professor. Why don't you explain how the stock market works? Like, just very
Yeah.
interesting questions like this about the general questions out there. Uh, for sure. I mean, for all of the occupations, I guess there's definitely expectations and maybe the idea of a persona. But I would like
Uh-huh.
to still very uh, close to what we present anyway, although for all of us it may be a different experience, right? Because I do remember, I mean, some people view, for instance, teaching as also a time to perform, where you're sort of talking to an audience, whereas maybe not all academics view it that way. For stand-up comedy, the persona creation is way more conscious and intentional.
Right.
But of course, being an academic also requires conveying of ideas and hopefully doing it in
Uh-huh.
a interesting, engaging way, and that may definitely be similar in that sense. But in stand-up comedy, it's very, very conscious effort that
Uh-huh.
you're absolutely a different, like here's an anecdotal thing that I'm going to share. When I perform my stand-up, and when I, of course, I have my comedian friends who are performing with me, and sometimes I do invite my academic friends. And for instance, my academic friends would be, after hearing my bit, they would be interested in knowing, oh, was that real? Like, when did that happen? When did that happen?
Uh-huh.
I never heard about that story. Of course, we exaggerate stories. Whereas my comedian friends would always assume the story is not even
Uh-huh.
there to begin with. And they would be shocked if I say, oh, this actually happened. And they were like, oh, really? I had no idea. So here's how the two worlds actually view comedy
Hmm.
very differently. It is, I think, because comedians know that everything that you do on stage is a very, very conscious creation, step by step, and very intentional. But the key to make it look successful or be successful in stand-up comedy is to make sure that it seems very spontaneous, that it seems
Hmm.
very authentic and right on spot. It's a meticulously practiced form of art. It's distinct from
Uh-huh.
everything I've seen in my life. I used to practice talks and stuff, and now everything seems so easy because
Uh-huh.
stand up, you have to even study or practice your pause.
Right. So
So
you have to make it seem conversational, even if the pauses and every little detail is actually scripted.
exactly, and everything is scripted. Like sometimes some
Hmm.
people talk about their favorite comedians and they say, oh, they were so natural. I mean, who knows? Maybe sometimes, of course, there's crowd work and natural jokes come in, but most of the act is always very well practiced. It should be,
Hmm.
but you never say that. You're like, oh, the other day I was talking to my mom, and can you believe she said that? You just sort of go
Uh-huh.
into the story like this.
Now, in academia, you do have hopefully intellectual humility where you can say, like, I don't know. But there also seems to be this pressure to come up with an answer. So again, let's say you're the only academic at a dinner table. We're
Mhm.
psychologists, and what we get asked about the stock market, we could say, I don't know anything more than you. But there seems to be this pressure to infuse your psychology knowledge into it. And there's this joke about I don't remember what the phrase is, but like trying to explain everything in the world through a single lens.
Yeah. That's so true. And I think that pressure again probably exists for all of us in different roles out there. Like I can imagine, obviously, if you're a doctor, I was going to say a medical doctor, but only academics say medical doctor. So if you're a doctor, for instance, I'm sure you get lots of questions about anything outside of your expertise area as well. I was thinking one thing that's nice about being an academic that I am starting to experience is that even though I'm still in the earlier years of my career, the more time goes, the more I think we feel comfortable. I hope that we all feel comfortable saying, I don't know. At the same time, with the pressure, so imagine I'm at the dinner table and they ask me about the stock market, and I can say, I actually don't know details about finance. We should have a finance professor. I should ask my friends, but I would still maybe provide some answers about the psychology of uncertainty, or some things that some of the things that we can draw from behavioral economics and things like that. So I try to do both. I try to still talk about the things I know, but saying I don't know is a pretty amazing thing to say, and I always feel happy when I'm able to say it. But I agree that there's a pressure. connecting this to impression management, sorry, I sort of go from stand-up to research back and forth. But probably when you say, I don't know, probably people may trust your expertise a little more if you still can provide some basis of your competence and expertise in your area, but can recognize that you say, I don't know. I'm not sure if it's a first impression, it's a different thing, but if they know about your expertise and competence, I'm sure it helps.
Right. So there's this balance between competence and confidence. And I think this taps into your research because to use the example of a doctor, again, a medical doctor, even if they don't know about the details of particular disease or whatever, they probably you don't want to say that. There's a fine line of like freaking your patient out by giving the impression you don't know. Like you might still have to give a scripted answer of like you're figuring it out and then go back to your colleagues and say you actually don't know and then figure out from them and then go back and you're sort of playing telephone.
Yeah. It's like such a fine line, right? Like I think maybe another reason why I love comedy and why I really think what I do for research and what I try to do as a stand-up comedian are not that distinct. Maybe it's in my mind, but I do see them as such similar paths. It's because everything is so nuanced with anything that we talk about right now. And we were just talking about being a stand-up comedian, but of course we get into impressions and competence and confidence and how do you signal those things as well. It's such a nuanced thing. There is no one for all approach. That's why before we started chatting for the podcast, I was telling you, when I study impression management, I'm very happy to study this because it's so fascinating to me. But at the same time, it's such a social paranoia because I'm constantly trying to think about, was that a mistake? Is that a because I study how our intuitions about impression management are often wrong. So I focus on mistakes such as humble brags, backhanded compliments, name drops, mansplaining, inside jokes, or other things that we do when we network, when we give feedback. There are tons of mistakes that we do. And I definitely live in this social paranoia. I think people who interact with me and who know about my research are in the same position. They are always asking me, is this a humble brag? Did I say something wrong? You tell me.
I can much more clearly see the connection between this research and comedy or just social world in general than others. Like, for example, I study hormones and brain development, and I also do ballroom dancing, but it would be a much greater stretch to say like, oh, I'm interested in dancing because when you get close with a partner, like the oxytocin is flowing and it's forming a physical bond in that way. That would be much more of a stretch.
Yes, but obviously there is a lot of social, emotional coordination, and maybe that's your common point for sure.
Okay, so it sounds like when we're dealing with things like what's bragging versus humility or displaying competence but not wanting to seem overconfident, there's like some fine tuning there. How does that work out? What is going on psychologically?
Yeah, so this is a question that I've been thinking about for a long time. And there are a few things that I can say as practical advice for all of us. But first, I'd like to identify why it is so hard. Like why it's so hard. Like even I mean, sometimes I ask this to my students. I tell them, okay, our exercise that right now we're going to brag. Just come up with a brag, write a LinkedIn post for me where you brag. And they have a very, it's not a comfortable thing. The reason is because we know bragging is bad, like modesty is a universal value, but there is another thing that makes it hard. And I think for our academic audience, this will be quite a known area. In social perception, of course, we have these two big dimensions that we care about: warmth and competence. And scholars have named them I don't know, communion, agency, or they're not exactly the same, but they're highly, highly correlated concepts. You know, you can be very communal or very agentic. You can be very warm or competent, or you can be socially desirable or intellectually desirable. So all of them get at the same sort of similar construct there. And it's very hard to signal both at the same time. The reason is signaling warmth and friendliness and trustworthiness versus signaling our competence, confidence, capability, intelligence. They entail different strategies. So, for instance, let's have a sort of in-person exercise. If I want to look very warm and likable to you, let's say I just started working at the same workplace as you, or you started, you know, let's say I just arrived and you're my coworker and I want to make sure that I'm invited to happy hours or your birthday, I would smile. I would be like, hey, Adam, how are you? You know, the comment you made today in the meeting was amazing. I loved your insight. So I ingratiate towards you. I smile. I just show you how trustworthy I am. I'm on your side. It's a very other-directed strategy. On the other hand, if I want to right now signal to all of our audience how smart I am, how competent, expert I am, I can start by saying, hello, everybody. I graduated from Harvard University. I studied math as an undergrad, and then I studied, you know, I got my PhD in organizational behavior. So this is all very self-focused, right? I'm not doing anything, I'm just like listing my accomplishments. And there's the risk there of looking as arrogant. Now, because these things require different strategies, it's very hard to get to both. And also, warmth judgments are much more quicker. So when we meet someone, that's the primary judgment that we have, right? We look at whether someone is friend or foe. That's one. But competence, on the other hand, is something that we can only probably achieve, if you want to signal that, in a long time. But most often, we are put in situations where we have to signal both quickly. So it's not like, you know, I have a job interview for 5 months and I can signal my competence and show them how much of a hard worker I am, how capable I am. No, I have like 10 minutes in this networking event or 20 minutes in this job interview, and I want to look both amazingly warm and amazingly competent. So that's the problem there. And I think your question was about, like, is there any way we can, you know, is there any solution to this? It's very context specific, but there are a few things that we can do. One is we should avoid some behaviors. So if you want to get the best of both worlds, we should not humble brag, for instance. That's one of the things that we showed.
Like when you're fake complaining about how poorly you did on an exam, it turns out you got an A minus.
Exactly. I'm like, you know, why do people hit on me even when I'm on my sweatpants? That doesn't make any sense. That was a very famous example. This is a real example, by the way, coming from Twitter. I used to open my talk about humble bragging with this real example. Or if people say, oh, you know, it gives me a headache. I have a job offer from both Goldman Sachs and McKinsey. Or, you know, do I go to Harvard or Princeton? Tell me, Adam. My life is so hard.
Right.
There's also something funny about humble brag.
But they must be doing that because they think that it's working. But when people humble brag, generally it kind of elicits this disgust response.
It's so your intuition is absolutely correct, which I find so intriguing and interesting. When we evaluate others, we do immediately spot the mistake. We're like, this is so fake, and I don't like you because you're a humble bragger. In fact, bragging is much better in terms of both warmth and competence. If you just bragged instead, I would like you more. I would think of you as more competent than if you humble bragged. Not that I love braggarts, but it's still better than humble braggers. And the thing is, it just, it just doesn't work. But when we are in that position, we still feel the need to soften our brag, or sometimes talk about our weaknesses. When people are asked, what's your biggest weakness? You know, the most common answers that we got in our surveys was, oh, I'm such a perfectionist. I work too hard.
Which is a humble brag.
Because you list that as a weakness. Because again, what we're going to do in that situation is not obvious, right? We don't know how to answer that question. Should I really talk about my weaknesses, or should I actually, again, soften it? And humble bragging seems like it's going to help us, but it doesn't. So number one, we should know the things that we should avoid. So we should not humble brag. Number two, another thing that we looked at, some people, anytime I talk about this, some people say, what if I don't say anything? I don't need to brag. How about I just don't share? Now, this may seem like a good strategy. It's intuitive. It's like maybe you think, oh, you're going to take the rewards of being modest and humble. Everyone will be like, oh my God, look at Adam, amazingly humble, never talks about his accomplishments. Well, number one, it's a risk for you because no one will know about your expertise or accomplishments. That's a risk that you are taking in that sense. But the worst part is that we also looked at how does it influence relationships. And first of all, we find a lot of people do hide their positive news. So they hide their success, thinking that if they share it, especially with another person who are kind of similar to them, so easily socially comparable to them. So imagine you're in the same workplace and you're up for a promotion and your friend is also up for promotion and you get it, they don't get it, but you're kind of in the equal ranks and you're good friends. Now, the intuition says, oh, I should hide it. I should not say anything so that I don't make them jealous or upset or, I don't make them feel bad. But then what happens is that when the other person finds out, they get very offended by that because
Offended by keeping it from them.
yes, because then they're like, wow, oh, you think I would be jealous for you? You think I wouldn't be happy for you? That's so insulting. That's so offensive. I'd rather wish that you told me, which is true. So if you share, there's no cost. But if you don't share, there's this cost of relationship maintenance is kind of damaged and hurt if you do that. So how should we share then? How should we share? So I listed a few things that we should avoid, few things that we should pay attention to, combining combining your brag with positive emotions or gratitude is a good idea. Because again, right now we are sort of helping with the warmth competence again, right? Okay, I'm going to say something, but I'm recognizing my team. So I'm sort of speaking to both sides, or again, combining it with positive emotions, except the phrase humbled. I'm so humbled. We tested that at the time. People don't like that phrase. Maybe it's overly used in social media. And another great technique is, of course, if we all have an intermediary who brags for us. So imagine we have a wing person who's just going around and telling great things about us. Why? Because people believe that it's legitimate because you're not the one who's bragging about yourself. Number two, it also leads to some curiosity. So imagine someone comes up to you and says, oh, hey, Adam, have you heard about Ovul? She's great. Oh, this felt very, very weird that I'm actually bragging about myself as if I'm a third person. It's getting very meta right now. But imagine you heard something great about me. Chances are you may Google me, want to find out more about me. There's that curiosity piece as well, which is a great thing.
And it allows you to validate it as opposed to thinking this person is exaggerating. And then if you validate it by the online search yourself, something about that doing the search yourself makes it seem more real. It's like, I confirmed this.
Exactly. It's all of us are much more legitimate, right? Than the person in front of us bragging or trying to self-promote. These are just few things that I can say, but there are so many different things that we can, and this is only in the bragging self-promotion domain, but in terms of impression management in general, there are lots of other things that we can do that both our amazing research team and other great researchers from other places have identified. And I'm happy to talk more about the tips.
What happens at the opposite extreme when you're dealing with feelings of jealousy or resentment? So for jealousy, you mentioned that in this case, someone very similar to you can receive good news and you'd be better. But I don't know if this is just a gut feeling or maybe I read something about it somewhere, but feelings that if someone else gets good news and they're very dissimilar to you, it's no threat whatsoever. But the more similar to you, the more you actually might be likely to get jealous, because then it starts to think, I could have done that. I could have received that award.
Yeah. So, with this research paper that I just described about how hiding success leads people to interpret it as very offensive, we did look at, whether people actually feel jealous or envious or not. And it is true. people do feel jealous and envious a little bit,
And is it
especially.
also true that you feel it more as the person becomes more similar to you?
Yes, the more socially comparable, the higher the likelihood of envy and jealousy. But by hiding the positive news, you do not help.
Mhm.
So what I'm trying to say is that if someone is going to feel jealous of this because they wanted the same thing, or because they are very socially comparable to you or similar to you, they're going to feel jealous anyway at some point.
Mhm.
So there's no way to regulate that. In fact, the reason why our participants, like our data have shown us, the reason why it's such an offensive thing is that people think, oh, you're trying to regulate my own emotions. It's not your place. If I feel envious, if I feel happy, that's my thing. It's not your thing. So what I'm trying to say is that is a very interesting other directed emotion. It's also such a, envy, jealousy is such a primal emotion that exists in literature or Greek mythology and things like that. It's such a fascinating
Mhm.
emotion, of course. um, but whether you hide or share your positive news doesn't really help the other side,
Mhm.
meaning that because eventually they will find out, right? If there's a way to hide it forever, sure, but eventually people find out about your positive news
Mhm.
because they are in the same environment with you. That's why you wanted to hide it in the first place.
Uh-huh. No, oftentimes when you're engaging in social comparison, especially if it's envy motivated, you might engage in these compensatory attacks. So you might think something like, oh, that person is more attractive than me, but it doesn't matter because I'm smarter than them. Or that person is smarter, but it doesn't matter because they're cutthroat and I'm such a caring person. So what's going on when you sort of feel the need to compensate by attacking the person in a different dimension, and B, when that doesn't work, like sometimes let's say you've built up a caricature of someone you view as a rival, and you're
Okay.
thinking they must be such a terrible person, and then you meet them and they're actually just warm and wonderful, and then you feel worse because you're like, oh,
Oh,
that's
they're
not
actually
fair.
nice too. They're actually a great person. Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's like there's this gut intuition of I guess equality of distribution among different things you can be successful at, whether that's looks or career success or how nice of a person you are. But then in reality, these things are just normally distributed, and there's going to be some small proportion of people who just win luck of the draw on every variable, and then there's going to be some who are dealt poor hands in every case. And so I guess that's a long-winded way of saying life's not fair. What do we do about it?
yeah, yeah. It's such an interesting concept to think about, like how comparative things are, and
Mm-hmm.
even when they don't need to be. It's interesting that you were talking about compensatory strategies, or what do people do. Another thing that we study again is this idea of backhanded compliments, where people, so if we give another example of backhanded compliments, if people tell me, oh, you're kind of funny for a young woman, if someone tells me
Mm-hmm.
that, like, I'm not happy about that because
For a professor.
oh yeah, you're fashionable for a professor. For an academic, you're okay. That's some fair share of compliments that we may have heard before. So these backhand compliments exist in different forms, and sometimes they are quite aggressive and stereotypical, like the ones we talked about. If someone says you're creative for a woman, you're funny for a woman, you're smart for a woman, or things like that, it's quite aggressive and very stereotype based and very offensive. Sometimes they are kind of more vague if someone reveals a surprise, for instance, based on their expectations, or you're actually smart. That's a very, very subtle backhand compliment right there. So they exist in many forms, and we did have lots of studies about why do people give backhand compliments, and there is not one single answer for that. It's a bit more complicated than the humble bragging story, but one context where backhand compliments are likely to happen was this sort of compensatory strategy where people are competing and they want to assert their superiority, so they are more likely to give a backhanded compliment instead of a compliment, especially if this is happening in front of a let's say
And
evaluator or something.
is there a
So
personality
please let
trait
me, this
behind
is
that?
sorry. Yeah, so just so that I say this too, because as a researcher, I want to make sure I reflect the results fully. This is just one context where backhanded compliments may occur. We're not saying
Hmm.
all backhanded compliments occur because people are out there to get each other. No, sometimes
Hmm.
people say these things without even being aware of their own comparison sets and stuff like that. Sorry, and you were asking something.
I'm wondering if there's a personality trait that's predictive of this, because there's a caricature of some types of people are just very easily jealous and they'll be the type to engage in these backhanded compliments, and then other people just will genuinely be excited if you have good news to share and won't even think about a backhanded compliment. So is it all context specific, or is there some underlying personality trait that predicts this?
Yeah, and that's a fantastic question, and I'm sure I'm not unfortunately I'm not a personality psychologist.
Uh-huh.
It would be another fascinating area that I would love. I wish I could get another PhD just focusing on that. And we know, for instance, things like both personality and also some personality disorders like narcissism predicts behaviors like that, or
Hmm.
predicts behaviors like how much of a threat you feel when you witness another person's success. As a researcher myself, in our project so far, we have focused on more of the sort of how does environment influence the likelihood of these behaviors, or even the perception of these behaviors as well. Um, so, it would be fascinating to. Another thing that I always also think about when I think about compliments or bragging or feedback or any of these behaviors that I study, I want to be in an organization, I want to be in an office where it's okay to share success and celebrate each other,
Hmm.
rather than everyone is hiding in a corner and just calling their mom, hey, I published. That would be a very, very interesting academic place to work at. I'm lucky
Hmm.
that right now I do view my workplace as a place where we definitely share and we're very happy for each other. So, but you can see how these behaviors that happen at the individual micro level can be a reflection of the culture that exists there.
Hmm.
Right. So, definitely a reflection of some personality traits as well. But going back to, so now I'm making a call back to our earlier conversation, going back to saying I don't know enough
Yeah.
to comment on the personality side. But I find both sides very interesting, both how the
Yeah.
personality influences the likelihood of these behaviors, or at the macro level, how does the environment and our culture influences likelihood of these behaviors?
Yeah, the statement, I wish I could get a second PhD in that, you could take on the surface as humble bragging, but it seemed very genuine and just like intellectual curiosity. But I'm wondering, is that just because I've had the chance to speak with you now for over half an hour, and we build up this friendly context? Or maybe I know you don't study nonverbal cues, but or maybe there was something nonverbal, like just the fact that you're smiling or you have like an upward pitch in your voice rather than seeming resentful, like darn, I couldn't have gotten a second PhD and now my life is ruined.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for saying it was genuine. But now that you say it, I am back to my own social paranoia again. Was that a humble brag? I hope it was not. But I mean, we know that everyone is vulnerable to making these mistakes. So I'm not gonna.
Well, what I'm thinking is if this was like a text, I think you could easily misinterpret it as a humble brag just based on the words alone. But then there must be something nonverbal going on where you can deliver the exact same words, but in a way that either seems passive aggressive or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, for instance, the dialogue matters too. I'm glad that you said, we've been talking for a while now, so we are already establishing some sort of a norm in our conversation, and we are starting to get to know each other. Uh, we usually we usually looked at one-time instances of these behaviors, or social media, which is unsolicited one-time declaration of brags or other interesting things that you say out loud to public. But it is true that the dialogue changes everything. For instance, if you read our paper, we pretty much argue and provide evidence humble bragging is not an ideal strategy. It's an ineffective strategy compared to bragging or even complaining. But a study that didn't end up in the paper, but we ran was if you, for instance, humble brag as a response to a compliment, then things are a little better for you, right? Like if, let's say someone tells you, oh, Adam, you're such a prolific researcher, and you say, oh, I'm just scattered, but trying to hang in there. You're sort of, it's a humble brag. I'm so scattered, I publish in different domains. By the way, it's kind of funny that most of our examples are in the academic domain too. Like people who are watching this would be like, these are such a nerdy, nerdy. Maybe it doesn't even
Yeah,
come
it's a nerdy show.
maybe it doesn't even come across as a humble brag to someone who doesn't care about papers or publications. But yeah, so the dialogue may change things. I really hope that it wasn't perceived as a humble brag, but I may be equally guilty.
So there's also the risk of certain conversations or questions that almost force you into a problem of either being non-humble or just being outright untruthful. So here's an example at risk of humble bragging myself. So oftentimes, I'm sure you experience this as well. You get asked where you go to school. You say Harvard. Someone might say something like, "Oh, you must be really smart," and that happened to me recently, and I responded, "What do you want me to say to that?" Either I say yes, in which case it sounds like I'm bragging, or I say no, in which case it's probably just lying and it sounds like humble bragging. It's almost like once that happens, there's no real good way out of it. It seems, but then I'm wondering, is that over intellectualizing it so that I'm placing the blame on the person who makes the comment?
It's not, I mean, there is no one to blame. I think it's just a hard game in itself. Anytime we with compliments too, because like in a way they're also giving you a compliment, right? But it's a very interesting thing to receive a compliment too. So there are different studies that I ran to understand this phenomenon. I think, so this would be if you sort of said something like, oh no, not always, but thank you, something like that, that would could be a humble brag, but it's still a response to a compliment. So it would be much better than a regular humble brag.
Because there is this desire that comes up to somehow minimize the claim that they're making.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that part of it seems to be a genuine goal of impression management, like not wanting to overinflate your ego.
Yeah, and in that type of paying attention to the balance of the emotional response from both the other side, and so far we talked mainly about the impressions like warmth, competence, liking, respect, things like that. But there's also the emotional response, right? And that's a very important part of impression management as well, because sometimes these behaviors stem from again the desire to make a good impression. Sometimes it's all about intrapsychic. Sometimes it's all about that's why I think humble brags are uncomfortable too, because the moment the other person humble brags, we try to comfort them. It's kind of like this weird zone. I think back to your example, if there is any question out there about how to respond to a compliment, we did actually test that. What's the best way to respond to a compliment? And I was someone who would get into a compliment loop. I still have that in me. Sometimes it comes up if someone tells me something nice. I'm like, oh my God, but look at you. You are also amazing. You are also super smart, which is not necessarily bad, but to keep things more efficient, a very graceful, I think we should say graceful, you tell me if I'm expressing it in English correctly, but a very genuine thank you is the way to go. So if someone tells you must be really smart, oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. Done. And then
it seems like self-awareness can also help diffuse the whole situation. I'll give you an example. So there was a former Harvard PhD graduate now doing a postdoc elsewhere. He came back here to give a talk. And at the beginning of the talk, trying to set up the laptop for the screen sharing, like was having trouble with the HDMI cord. And the student's former advisor said, "Did we really give you a PhD? You can't figure out the simple laptop thing." And the whole crowd got a laugh out of that. And there's this nice sort of self-awareness diffusing, like yeah, even after you get the PhD, little things like this are still going to happen.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm glad that you are bringing humor into this too. Again, going very meta back to our stand-up comedy conversation too.
Mhm.
Humor is obviously, when successful, it's a very good impression management strategy. But when successful, and successful humor is hard too, so most people refrain from that because
Right.
risk is higher.
So a related topic to humble bragging is virtue signaling, and this I think impacts comedy as well. And there's certainly a whole psychology behind it. Like lately, you hear about certain comedians or just public figures in general getting canceled, and if you get canceled, it's generally because people believe that you violated some moral norm, like you said something you shouldn't have, and
Mm.
often that might be very true. You shouldn't have said that, but then it it reaches this point to you have to ask, are there truly topics that are off limit, especially in comedy? Like you might say, you should never joke about that. But then you might also say, if it's genuinely in the spirit of comedy and it's just a joke, then we shouldn't take it too seriously.
Yeah. Are you asking my opinion on this, or more like a researcher comment on this? Well, not that it would differ.
Whatever you're most comfortable with. We could
I'm,
we could look at it from a scientific standpoint, saying like from a detached, what is going on here? Or we could say as a comedian, what do you think
yeah.
personally?
I mean, I'm comfortable with both of my answers, both as a comedian and researcher, because it's also a new thing, right? This
Mhm.
idea of it's kind of something that we're learning to navigate together. I don't know when exactly it started. I don't know how social media played a role. There's this outrage right now. There is, like, if something is wrong, there's an outrage, and there's the possibility of being canceled. Or I guess I know. Obviously, if we say the word accountability, that's another way to frame it. Maybe that's another way to think about it. When I mean,
Mhm.
I talk about this a lot with my comedian friends. Is a comedian, so far I never run into this issue because I mainly talk about my personal life right now. Like
Mhm.
I didn't get the chance to talk about social issues that much. And with my comedian friends, sometimes they do feel that things change, even in comedy clubs, not just on TV or not just on Twitter, but there's this there's something specific about the current time, current era that we're in, and comedy captures that. Maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it was okay to joke about topic X. Right now, it really doesn't. It seems distasteful. It's just not worth it. Um, it's a balance thing. One thing that at least one thing that we try to follow, when I really do work with a comedy mentor when I do stand-up comedy, and we really do share things with with my other comedian friends. I have a writing group, we practice together and things like that. If something seems offensive, uh, I think it's okay to apologize and understand, and make sure that you say, I hear you. um but with some topics, I guess it's a
Uh-huh.
bit different.
Because some topics everyone will think is okay, other topics you might have near unanimous agreement that's not okay. But then it's
Yeah,
those borderline cases where you get into virtual signaling territory because maybe there's a topic that you or I think is fine, and then someone else comes along and says,
that's
I would
probably.
never joke about that. And
Yeah,
when they're saying that, you can tell just by the intonation in the voice, like, I wouldn't. There's this virtue signaling element of like trying to signal maybe implicitly, I'm better than you because I wouldn't joke about that.
yeah. Or I mean, it signals lots of things, right? If the comedian continues to make the joke, does that mean they are really so adamant about freedom of speech or their comedic ideas or whatever? Or if they say, sorry, I didn't mean that, does that mean they're very ready to give up their comedic persona? And but it really depends on the joke and the topic too.
Mhm.
um so yeah, very, very, very complicated topic. Just because I don't think we still don't know the answer to that, even as a society. Maybe some amazing morality researchers are studying that, and that would be an amazing topic. I know that someone was studying how do we evaluate the artist after they make such a big mistake. Do we still consume their products even if the product is coming from like the past and things like that, which is an interesting question, right?
I wonder if it relates to theory of mind, because I think thus far a lot of this has to do with the ability to imagine yourself in someone else's shoes, and that's perhaps why it might upset you if someone didn't tell you something, because if you're imagining yourself in their shoes, perhaps the only reason that you wouldn't do that is because you worry that they'll get jealous, and then they can sense that, so there's sort of this metacognitive awareness, and that's what leads to the emotional reaction. And then in the case of virtue signaling, um, there's again this sort of metacognitive thought of like, are they saying that because they genuinely care about an issue and want to make sure that we're on the same page, or are they saying that because they're trying to signal somehow that they're better?
Yeah, definitely. And we can also even connect it to styles of humor too.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you know, uh, there's this conceptualization that some of us really like very sweet humor, some of us like more provocative, more thought-provoking humor. Some people think stand-up comedy should always be thought-provoking. Some people think I mean, there's no right or wrong, by the way. This may be a preference thing. I must say, before I started doing comedy, I also would think, oh, my sense of humor is so smart. I only like very smart humor. Now I appreciate all kinds of humor because it's so hard. Physical humor is amazingly hard. Silly humor is amazingly hard. If you do impressions, that's so hard. If you do super smart social commentary like George Carlin, that's amazing. So right now I have all the respect for all the kinds of humor. So there's no absolutely right or wrong, but you can imagine based on the preference of the audience for the styles of humor, some of these topics may be more okay, less okay.
I went through a bit of a similar evolution because I think early teens or childhood, everyone's going to have certain immature, like fart jokes or something. And then you're reaching a state in the later teen years thinking, like, I'm so mature now, I'm not going to do that anymore. And then when I got to college and I was taking some philosophy classes, we were reading some ancient Greek different plays, and some of them were very serious, but some of the old comedies, like that are by renowned Greek poets, had just as many fart jokes as like the teenagers are making, and they're considered old great literature. So it's very interesting. It just signals something universal about uh, what humans find funny or entertaining.
Exactly. Or I mean, you can again, when we watch George Carlin, even right now, after many years he passed away. I mean, some of his bits are still very relevant, and in fact, it becomes trending on Twitter. And I would always be amazed. I was like, wow, a new political event, and here we have George Carlin again. Or sometimes you would see Robin Williams bits or stuff like that. At the same time, I was speaking of fart jokes. If someone, I'm very sorry to deliver this punchline and joke about fart jokes, but here we are. Why not? Because I'm here as both as a researcher and comedian. So here's a fart joke, and I find this is funny too. If someone says, "Okay, here's the joke. What happens if you fart and sneeze at the same time? Your body takes a screenshot." That's a funny joke.
Yeah.
If you're an
If you
iPhone
get the
user.
iPhone, yeah.
Yeah. So, but it's okay to laugh at both, both this very kind of weird physical image of a phone versus your body, plus the social commentary. So there's no one right or wrong. It's a very balanced, nuanced thing. Maybe that's why it's so fascinating.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Ovul, I want to close asking you what you're currently working on and what you're most excited about in your research.
Sure. So right now we are working on other different interesting strategies that people use to impress others, but it actually backfires. And one of my favorite current projects right now is about, excuse my language, but it's about ass kissing. Uh,
And we all recognize it as a real phenomena, so we need some science there.
Definitely. And what's also so interesting? When we started working on this project, we talked about, is there another word we can use? So all of the English words that our synonyms of ass kissing also include some sort of not very nice image like brown nosing or licking, or but in every language,
Yeah,
there's
sucking up, I guess, is the nicest version, and that still has some connotation.
some connotation. It's so true for every language. Like we looked at other languages, and in every language it starts with it's about some kissing, licking, some sort of disgust inducing language form, like very descriptive form. And it happens a lot, especially in organizations and where status and power and rewards matter. And what we knew from research, from prior research, is that if you compliment someone, you get rewards. So for the flatterer, they get good results. We also know that we don't like the person who engages in ass kissing because they're doing something for their status, and it's so disgusting. That's sort of almost reflected in even these expressions that we have in our language. What we don't know, so imagine you are with your hero. Okay, imagine you're with your advisor, Adam, at a conference, and then you really admire this person a lot. They're your leader, they're your professor, they're your advisor, they're your friend. You are learning a lot from them, which is definitely the case when you're a PhD student. I mean, I remember my own experience as well. That was one of the beauties of doing a PhD. But then imagine someone else at the same conference comes up to your advisor and engages in asking, and imagine your advisor falls for it. I don't want to put your advisor on the spot, but imagine your leader or the person that you look up to falls for it, and they're like, oh, really? They cannot see through it. So we're looking at that, and we're looking at what happens if someone that you really admire falls for it. And what we find is, of course, it's such a big disappointment. I described the feeling as a flower dies in your heart when you witness that, because you realize your hero is very naive. And you also realize, there are other connotations that you have for your career, for your industry. So it sort of kills your motivation as well.
And my thought would have been that you would experience some sort of like moral outrage or unfairness, like thinking, if this works, this means they're shortcutting their way up the ladder. Whereas presumably if you built that relationship more organically, that was harder. So it feels like this unfair element.
Exactly. Exactly. We look at that. Your perception of fairness goes down. How you view your leader, their impression becomes much less favorable or not favorable.
Now, is there simultaneously a self-worth inflation by thinking like, well, I must be very smart if I can recognize this, even if my advisor can't?
Oh, interesting. We haven't looked at that. But the funny thing about compliments is that when we witness it, it's very hard. It's great to see. We can see everything clearly like an HD TV. When we're the recipients, it's very hard to see.
Like related to that idea of attacking someone else as compensation for not wanting to feel jealous or whatever, are people reliably good at telling when ass kissing is really ass kissing, or is there a chance at overdiagnosing it because their negative bias is influencing what could be genuine compliments?
I think the observers usually do not give the benefit of the doubt, meaning that if there's some sort of a status differential between the recipient and the person who's giving the compliments, no matter how genuine it is, they do still attribute some sort of ass kissing to that. But we looked at different types of ass kissing events. Like imagine it's a very well-deserved compliment. Like so you go to a Nobel Prize winner and you're saying your research has changed the world. True. They want to know the price. Versus, you overdo it, or you sort of compliment the person about their looks or their outfit and things like that. So some types of ass kissing are evaluated more negatively than others. So the well-deserved compliments are kind of more okay, but the observer still makes that attribution just because there is that difference, like status differential. And also you're asking for a favor. So this person depends on this person, this recipient, for some kind of a favor, whether it's admission to a school, promotion at workplace, or things like that. So you're right. There's some of the mistakes coming from the observers side because they're kind of too judgmental. At the same time, we never know. Again, if we ask the recipient, They may just think, I mean, they're giving me compliments because I'm great.
Right.
It's
I
so
realize this is again a personality question, so I should check myself on that. But it's a personality question in the sense that maybe there are just some people who are more likely to look for instrumental motives, and other people who are more likely to see compliments as genuine.
yeah, and this is more another reason for me to go back to grad
The
school,
second PhD.
get that get that. But fascinating questions, of course. I mean, all of them are very integrated with each other, of course. Yeah.
Thank you very
Oh,
much for your
another,
time. Oh,
sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
Another thing that we study is we also look at networking behavior, so how people network, how people introduce themselves. And of course, we have very limited time and space when we introduce ourselves. We focus again on just the accomplishment side. But the
Uh-huh.
more we can make it sound like a journey, the better.
Right.
Now, the question is, how do you make it a journey? I have more things to say about that, but I know we are running out of time. But if you're going to introduce yourself, and if you're at a networking event, try to say something about your journey.
Uh-huh.
Uh, Even if it's kind of irrelevant, you can just be like, "Hey, I started learning English at 15."
Mhm.
Like, and you'll be memorable, and it tells lots of things to the other side without necessarily listing your credentials. You know?
What's going on with try-harding? Like when someone is, let's say they're prepared to talk and it's so well scripted, but also you can tell like they're looking at flashcards, or just it seems so scripted that it seems fake. So it's on one hand, it's like you want to applaud them, they're well prepared, but on the other hand, I guess there's this intuition that if you were genuine, you would be less prepared.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we haven't looked at that, of course, but
Uh-huh.
something that I said about stand-up comedy at the beginning really sort of speaks to the same idea, right? It's an incredibly meticulously, diligently practiced art form that you
Uh-huh.
even know down to the sub-second of pause that you're making. But the key to make it successful is to make it very spontaneous, so that it's a shared experience between you and audience. And I imagine it's the same for presentations and talks as well. I mean, there's nothing wrong with prepping a lot. I would appreciate if the speaker for me is very ready, but at the same time, we are sharing some experience, and rather than seeing them very rehearsed and mechanical, it would be good to see them as authentic. So if you're very, 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 very practiced, you would come across as very, very,
Uh,
very
so
authentic.
if you come across as very, very, very prepared, but also like in an uptight type way, it just means you haven't practiced
You
enough to
haven't
reach the
practiced enough.
fluency.
I mean, I can say
Uh-huh.
that for stand-up. I don't know, for presentations, I'm not sure if I can say that. But yes, one way to look at it is that if you look very comfortable and genuine, that's also another sign of being very well prepared, right? Because you're making it seeming like as if it's happening on the spot.
Mhm.
Oh, you at the same time know what you're going to say by heart.
Uh-huh.
Uh, you have done it a lot. Like, you have clearly some expertise there.
That's what I love about these podcasts, because they're not scripted at all. And for the most part, they seem very fluid. So you can tell that you're an
Yeah. Oh
expert
my God.
in
No, it's a whole
all of this stuff.
All natural flow. I'm glad we did this without any script, but I'm sure it
Yeah,
looked very natural. Well, it was.
indeed. Thank you very much for your time, Ovul.
Thank you very much, Adam.